Hey there, this is my video submission for Element 9, which is about proficiency scales and learning targets. And so what I want to do is just to give a brief rundown of how we got to where we are and how I use that information, or how I use our proficiency scales and learning targets to think about kind of a progression, and that's kind of going to do it. So just to begin with, when we first started off, we had teams of teachers who sat down to write all of our proficiency scales, I guess, our learning targets at that time, because we didn't have proficiency scales. So I sat down to, excuse me, to write all of them out. All of them, of course, are aligned at that point, were aligned just to the Colorado academic standards. And as soon as Common Core came along, they were realigned to represent those and to incorporate those as well. So, in the beginning we had a zillion of them, it seemed like, for each level, and over the first, I think, 3 or 4 years, they changed them. We got new ones. We got new ones. I think it seemed like every year, or something changed about them every single year. I'd say for at least the first 3 or 4 years, possibly, of our CBS system, which was that took a while, and honestly, that was it was a point of frustration and a point of contention for teachers. And so eventually they said, okay, hey, we're not going to change that now for, I think they said 3 or 4 years, I want to say. And so we're actually on the last year of that change freeze, which has been really nice to be able to get to know them well. They don't move around. You can know what to expect. And the same with the students. The students know what to expect. And now I believe we're actually, next year, they're going to change them up again. Not drastic changes, right, but meant to update things and keep things fresh and new. And so the rationale behind all of them, really is the Common Core state standards. Now, for me as a teacher, what I have done is I have said, hey, and I'm using my literacy level 5 as an example here. For literacy level 5, there are 35 learning targets, and I've said to myself over the years, it's just too much. There's too many here for one kid to wrap their minds around over the course of the year. And so I remember hearing you talk, Dr. Marzano, about this, and that you need to make it manageable. And only until this year did it click that that's something I could actually do. So what I've decided to do was I did write up what we used to call a capacity matrix. Let me find this. We used to have these for every single level that was put out by the district. And, it looked like this. It was nice. And the kids could track and mark off what they'd done and keep track of those things. And then somebody said, well, wait a second. If they're doing this, then maybe the teacher might just decide to start teaching from left to right and take care of all these conventions of standard English first and then vocabulary next and then move this way. There's no logical progression. We have to stop this. And so they told everybody, stop using these capacity matrices, even to the point of I made them up again, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. They told me that I couldn't use them. I'm older and wiser now, and I realize that I should just go ahead and use them anyways because they make sense. And my biggest rationale behind this is that you're clustering these proficiency scales by strands, which makes sense and is appropriate, and it's appropriate for students to understand that some of these have themes that are in common and they are clusterable. And so what I did was I just recreated it. This is my level 5 capacity matrix that my students use to track, and you can actually even see there's one on the board back over there that we use as a whole class to track their progress, to track where they're at. We have basically taken this, which was one of the points that I made. We've basically taken our target browser and just kind of flipped it on its side, right? I mean, this is a capacity matrix for all intents and purposes. And so what I've done as a teacher is I've said to myself, 35 is much too many, and I've narrowed this level 5 down to 24. And my thought process behind choosing which 24, which ones to stay and which ones to go, were basically that it needed to be something tangible that the students could do, something tangible that they could track within a relatively short amount of time. I'm not to say that long-term tracking is impossible for these students, but in order for us to have it be relevant and pertinent at the moment, it needed to be something that they could track right away. So some of them I got rid of, and some of the ones that I got rid of or trimmed the fat, I would say, is like this one here, L203, is using great appropriate knowledge of language and its conventions when writing, speaking, reading, or listening. That's a really big, overarching learning target. And so to me, to get the kids in and tracking all of that, that was one I could do without, because ultimately the kids we're using our conventions of standard English up here. So there are learning targets for these that the kids are tracking. There's proficiency scales that we're working on. There's also, we're going to have writing on the bottom. So this is just something that we're going to do. The kids will be doing this for sure. And it's something that I will be tracking and I will be scoring. But as far as it goes, they needed to be presented with a nice little package of learning targets that they were responsible for. And this was one that I felt like they didn't need to be responsible for at that time. And there's a handful of them in there. And this kind of skips down to the point of the last one here, which was, or this one, for those ones that span the entire year, how do I assess them differently and address them throughout the year? And ultimately, some of these are things that are a little bit more of a summative assessment, but that through Empower and through the use of Empower on ones like this, it's more of a by the end of the year kind of a thing, or if you're by the end of the point where you're ready to move up your level kind of a thing, let's go back and let's reassess. And so it'll just take a look at all of the data that I have at that point to bump you up or go back and revisit some certain things. But to me, this is accumulation of all of this and some of these writing ones down here. So some of those I took out. There's other ones as well. It's like by the end of the year, read and comprehend informational texts. Yeah, that's great. I'm not going to have the kids track that. How would they track that over the course of the year about whether or not they can read, comprehend informational texts? I mean, we could take summative data from their assessments, right, from their Scantron test, and I could take other data that they were getting from their park exams and those types of exams and bigger assessments. And ultimately, I could, if I wanted to, I certainly could include that, and we certainly could spend some time going over it, talking about it, tracking it, setting goals for it, and all that stuff. Just to me, it was one that was just a little bit too heavy. It was just a little too big, and I wanted the students to have a nice little pack, like I said, a nice little arrangement of learning targets that they could work with. So, anyways, like I said, I narrowed those down to 24, and here they are. So 24 nice, neat little learning targets that the students can do. So then, as far as it goes for a progression, for all of my math learning targets, progression is pretty much standard and set because of the math curriculum that I'm using. I use Engage New York. I find it to be a really good curriculum. I find it to be really rigorous, and it does cover all my bases. So, before you start teaching something like this, I had to sit down. I had to spend a good amount of time making sure that it was going to check off all the boxes, if not all of them, most of them. It does check off all the boxes, but to make sure that it takes care of all the standards that we have within our system. Because our system, we're not using exact replicas of the Common Core state standards, but it's something that we've evolved for our system. We have to make sure that all of them are covered, and they all are. And so since they're all covered, and this does have a curriculum moving from Module 1 down to, in this case, this is grade 4, but all the way down through the modules and all different topics, it works out really well, and I don't have to worry about my progression here. My progression is already set. And in something in math, it's a lot more tangible, right? It builds upon each other. Everything works very nice and neatly like math does. And then when it comes to literacy, of course, things are different. So my thoughts when it comes to literacy are several. One, our district did and set aside a progression for this. They recommend a progression for this. We sat down maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and they had all the learning targets, and they put them in a big pile, very dramatically, put them in a big pile on your table. Here you go. Here's all the proficiency scales. Now we need to go about laying them out in order, and you were supposed to put all of these learning targets in order as to when you would teach them, right? And it was a good exercise in thinking about how they fit together. It was nice. I liked it. For me, when it came down to literacy, though, this is what they came up with. What they came up with was a very linear progression. And I think when it comes to something like literacy, I don't think that this model, this diagram, is a good diagram. I don't think so. Because you can't put all of these things in a single line. It doesn't work that way. And I think that they should have rethink the way that they do this. You have grammar, sentences, and spelling. And if I'm looking at this correctly, this being the beginning of the year and this being the end of the year, I'm waiting until 3/4 of the way into the school year before I start teaching grammar, sentences, and spelling and capitalization, punctuation. I don't agree with that. at the same time, I also don't agree that I think that something like we have argumentative down here, I have argument and reasoning up here, and I have speech writing all the way up top. I would put those three together. I think you deal with argumentative and argument and reasoning, and you're reading texts about opinions, and you're reading these things that fire kids up. And we can also then write our own papers, our argumentative writing, about how we're getting fired up. And then we can use speech writing, so we can write a speech where we're standing up in front of people because we're already fired up to give our speech. And so I think these are way more interconnected than this progression here shows. And so I know that's not the question. The question is how I do it. So when it comes to me, what I do is, everything is taught together. The standards of conventions of standard English are taught with the writing, as they should be. And writing generally is taught when it comes to a written response for what we're doing as far as reading in class. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we don't teach writing for fun, and we don't do that. But most of it is in there. So these things are all tied together. When I think about reading, for me it starts with R1. So there's R1, which is key ideas and details, which is basically things like quoting and inferencing, and main idea and theme, and story elements, and making connections. And so these are kind of the building blocks, the bread and butter things that you need in order to be successful in literacy as a student. And so I always start with R101 because I think you need to be able to quote from a text and say, hey, I used this, or this is why, when you're doing themes, or when you're doing story elements, or when you're doing connections, or anything else, you need to do that. So that's my starting point always. And then, excuse me, generally I'll buzz through the R1s. We'll go to themes and central ideas, or we'll do story elements, or we'll do connections. And it kind of depends on the text and what you're using. Right now, we're doing themes because we just finished A Tale of Despereaux, and it's a really great book, and it has a lot of different themes in there that are very obvious and accessible to kids. So it's a really good point for me to go about doing themes and central ideas. And so, you kind of deal with that. And if the students, if they're not getting it, and my students are, and it's something they're getting, but you could always adjust. You could always jump over to another one and say, hey, why don't we try this? And maybe once we understand our story elements a little bit better, settings or events in the story, then we can come back and talk about theme. Because maybe, ultimately, as far as progression goes, it does make a little more sense to talk about your view, the points of view and settings and events in the story before you go about talking about theme. But like I said, for us, it made more sense because of the text that we were on. And we're actually doing theme right now, and we're going to jump to story elements next. And, it kind of depends on how you as the teacher frame it. So once we're done with this R1, then we are going to go into R2 and start doing a little more structure, overall structure, cause and effect, problem, solution, those types of things, and analyzing multiple accounts of the same event or same topic. We're using some of those skills now, some of those main ideas and themes and story elements to start to put things together. And then ultimately we're getting into integrating these things like literary comparisons and rhetorical criticisms. And so let me see how that builds. As far as it goes for me, I always use Empower playlists to write out my progressions, to go through these things, and ultimately it is something that I do just have in my mind, and probably at this point enough experience in teaching to make sure that I'm covering them all over the course of time. So let's see. The third point on this one was the ones that span the entire year. Yeah. And, I guess, I think I've kind of covered everything here. Hey, Reno. I've kind of covered everything here. I think the biggest thing that I would say, and the biggest thing I would talk about when it comes to proficiency scales, is that I have really, the biggest change I think I've made, and the biggest thing that's affected the way that I teach, as far as being, I think, a quality teacher in a competency-based system, has been putting these learning targets into the hands of the kids. I think as teachers, we always really like to, back in the day, you would just, we got to put the learning target up on the board, right? You have to just write the target on the board. And if you write it on the board, then the kids will see that, and they'll know what they're doing, and they'll see what you're doing, and it's purposeful, and it's great. And yeah, I mean, that was a step in the right direction. Was, you know, identifying what it is you're working on. Today we're going to be reading. We're going to be doing R102, L105, R102, and we're going to talk about theme. And we're going to today. This is our description. We're working towards this, but we wouldn't break that down. And so then, okay, we started breaking it down a little bit. And the biggest thing for me was putting this into the hands of the kids and using it on a daily basis, right? And so having the proficiency scales, they're no longer just mine as the teacher. They no longer just belong to me. They belong to the kids. And once the kids take on that ownership, obviously then it's a lot more meaningful. And so you know, we're doing this one right now. The kids know, they can tell you it's R102. They can tell you which indicator they're working on, and they can even tell you how they're doing on that specific indicator. And that intentionality has made all the difference in my class. And it's, I don't know if it's helped. That's a lot of heavy lifting to do, and they can help us with the heavy lifting, and we can all carry it along together. I think once you also put it in their hands, then you can see what they're doing with it and how they're dealing with it, and then that can help you make adjustments, right? So, you know, I obviously I think, you know, I talk to new teachers, and I tell, you know, the first thing you got to get down really is you have to have a good classroom management system, and a system that is a system that enables all of this to happen, system of reflection and patience and kindness and compassion and intentionality and all of that. But really, when it comes down to your actual instruction, the first step, the biggest step you can make is turning these loops into the kids' hands. And kindergarten kids can do it all the way up. You know, it starts that early. I've seen it work. I think that someday I would probably like to challenge myself and go down to those little levels and see how see how I can do there. Right now I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. And anyways, you know, just to I don't know what I'm trying to say. That, you know, these proficiency scales, it's pretty cool, and it's been a big game changer for me in my teaching. So that's it. Hope it's all clear. Hope I didn't babble too much. Thank you very much.